The storm hit without warning. One moment, Elias was near the Hillary step, the wind biting through every layer of his gear. The next, a blizzard of white engulfed him, erasing the trail, the tents, and even his companions from view. His fingers, stiff with frostbite, clutched the ice axe, his only lifeline against the mountain's unrelenting fury. Visibility was nil, and each step was a gamble, each breath a challenge against the icy wind that seemed to claw at his lungs. Hours blurred into one another. The storm's roar was deafening, drowning out the world, and soon Elias realized with a chilling clarity that he had been separated. Alone. The Sherpas, his fellow climbers, even his own team, they were gone. He stumbled blindly, hoping for the faintest sign of the camp, but there was nothing. Just the unbroken, blinding white and the constant gnaw of fear. Night fell, or perhaps it had been night all along. In the blizzard's heart, time was meaningless. Elias collapsed behind a jagged rock, shivering uncontrollably. He tried to eat, to drink, but his supplies were gone, lost in the chaos of the storm. The cold was more than just a temperature. It was a living thing, creeping into his bones, whispering doubts, threatening to steal his mind as well as his body. His breaths came shallow and ragged. He whispered to himself, a feeble incantation against despair. "I have to survive. I have to make it." But the words felt hollow. Survival seemed impossible. He had trained for Everest for years, but nothing could have prepared him for this level of isolation. By the second day, hunger gnawed at him, raw and relentless. His lips were cracked, his tongue dry, his stomach a hollow drum. Snow and ice became his only sustenance. Each step was agony, but he forced himself forward, guided by some primal instinct that screamed, "Don't stop. Don't die here." It was then, as he crawled over a ridge, that the hallucinations began. First, small and indistinct, shadows moving in the periphery, whispers carried by the wind. Elias shook his head violently, insisting that his mind was playing tricks. But as he trudged through the desolate expanse, he saw her, or rather, felt her before he saw her. A figure in the snow, luminous and impossibly serene, standing on a plateau above him. A woman, clothed in a flowing robe that shimmered despite the storm, hands clasped in a gesture of peace. Elias blinked, his vision blurring, mind teetering between frostbite delirium and awe. He wanted to call out, but his voice was gone. He staggered toward her, unsure if he was awake or trapped in some cruel dream. "Elias," she said, not with sound, but with a presence that filled his mind. "Do not give up. You are not alone." His knees buckled. He fell into the snow, cold searing his skin, and for a moment everything faded. Darkness, cold, despair. Then a warmth, subtle but undeniable, wrapped around him like a cloak. He felt himself lifted, almost carried, the weight of hopelessness lifting. Hours, or perhaps minutes, he could not tell, passed. When Elias opened his eyes, he was in a small crevasse, shielded from the wind. Snow had drifted around him, forming a natural cocoon. He was wet, frozen to the bone, but alive. Somewhere far below, a faint crackle of voices reached his ears. Rescue teams. Other climbers. He didn't know, but the sense of being watched over, protected, refused to leave him. He tried to move, and found that his body, though weak, obeyed. He rose unsteadily, gripping his ice axe for support. The storm had lessened, leaving a brittle, icy calm in its wake. Above, the sky was clear, sharp and cruelly bright against the mountain's whiteness. Elias squinted and saw the faint outline of a helicopter, a dot moving against the horizon. His heart jumped, a chaotic drum of hope and disbelief. But the mountain was never done with him. As he scrambled toward the ridge, the snow beneath his feet gave way, plunging him into a hidden crevasse. Pain exploded across his shoulder, and he hit the ice with a bone-shaking jolt. Gasping, he realized that even now, salvation was not simple. The mountain demanded respect, always, and even miracles did not absolve its dangers. He used his axe, digging into the wall of ice, clawing his way out. Each movement was agony, each second a battle against exhaustion, frostbite, and fear. But the vision of her, the serene figure that had given him hope, kept him moving. He whispered prayers he didn't even believe in, prayers born out of sheer desperation. When he finally emerged, bruised and bleeding, the sun was dipping low. Its light was pink and liquid, gilding the mountain's jagged ridges in surreal beauty. He fell to his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks, staring at the horizon. Against every rational calculation, against all probability, he had survived. And there she was again, at the edge of his vision, a glimmer of the figure in the snow, smiling. Not real, perhaps, but enough. Enough to make him believe in life, in possibility, in miracles. Elias knew he would not survive alone for long, but now he had something stronger than hope, a reason to keep moving, to fight for each breath, each step, each heartbeat. Night fell again, but this time Elias was ready. He dug a shallow snow shelter, crawling inside and covering himself with the few dry layers he had left. He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion claim him for the first time in days. Sleep came, light and dreamless, and in it, he dreamed not of snow, not of ice, not of death, but of warmth, light, and the soft glow of a presence that refused to leave him. By morning, the storm had passed entirely. The mountain was quiet, almost reverent, as if it had paused to acknowledge his struggle. Elias rose, shivering, body aching, and started moving downhill toward the base camp. He was weak, every step a monumental effort, but he had a guide now, not a person, not a map, but a feeling. A certainty that he was being watched over, protected. Hours passed. Pain was constant, hunger acute, but he pressed forward. The echo of the figure's presence was a rhythm in his chest, steady and unwavering. Then he heard it, human voices, faint but unmistakable. He stumbled toward them, arms flailing, shouting hoarsely. Rescue teams, finally. Figures emerged from the snow, faces etched with shock and relief. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, carried him to safety, administered first aid, oxygen. He didn't speak much, could barely form words, but he kept looking toward the horizon. For a moment, just a fleeting heartbeat, he saw her again. The glow of serenity, of hope, of impossible salvation. And then she was gone, leaving only the lingering warmth in his chest and a sense of gratitude too deep for words. Elias survived, against all odds. The storm had taken many, but he had been spared. He would carry the memory of that figure, that presence, for the rest of his life, a reminder that even in the most impossible moments, miracles could happen. Even on Mount Everest, even alone, even facing death, hope could find you. The warmth of the rescue team's blankets was almost alien. Elias's body felt like it belonged to someone else, every joint and muscle screaming in protest, every breath a battle. They guided him to a makeshift medical tent at base camp, where the scent of antiseptic and diesel from the generators assaulted his frost-numbed senses. Yet amidst the chaos of radio chatter and shuffling boots, Elias couldn't stop thinking about her, the luminous figure that had saved him. "Sir, can you tell us your name?" a medic asked, her face framed by frost-lined goggles. Elias tried to answer, but only a rasp emerged. He shook his head. Words had lost their meaning in the storm, drowned by days of isolation. The medic didn't press. She helped him drink warm tea, small sips that scalded yet soothed, and wrapped him in an insulated sleeping bag. For the first time in what felt like eternity, Elias allowed himself to relax, though sleep remained elusive. Memories of the storm gnawed at the edges of his mind, a mixture of terror and awe. He thought of the ice cliffs that had threatened to swallow him, of the yawning crevasses that had nearly ended everything. And then he remembered the figure, standing impossibly serene on the ridge, calling to him in a voice that was felt more than heard. Had it been real? Or had his mind, battered by cold and fear, conjured a savior in his desperation? The question haunted him through fitful hours of rest. Even as rescuers worked tirelessly to stabilize him, he could not shake the feeling that the mountain itself had delivered him into her hands. That somehow, against all reason, he had been spared. By the second day, Elias could speak more clearly. He described the storm, the loss of his team, the endless bone-chilling days spent wandering the ice, and then the vision. The medical staff exchanged glances, cautious but polite. Some nodded as if humoring a delirious survivor, others were silent, unsure whether to call it hallucination or divine intervention. Elias didn't care. He only knew that he had survived. And he had a debt to the mountain and whatever had saved him. Despite his weakened state, his mind began to replay the journey with brutal clarity. The first day after the storm, he had wandered in circles, each step sinking into deep snow, his fingers uselessly trying to warm themselves against his body. He had almost given up when hunger had gnawed too violently to ignore. Snow alone had become sustenance, but it could not stop the hunger that clawed at him relentlessly. It was on that second day that he stumbled across the small plateau, the one that seemed to rise impossibly above the surrounding ice. He remembered collapsing there, thinking this would be his grave. And then she appeared. Not quite in his vision, not fully corporeal, but undeniably present. Her hands extended, almost as if she were reaching through the storm itself. "Do not give up," he whispered, even as he felt his mind blur. He did not know if she would hear him, but the words mattered. Something in him, maybe his own instinct, maybe some miraculous force, refused to succumb. He had followed her direction instinctively, moving as if guided by invisible hands. When the crevasse nearly claimed him, he remembered her presence, steady and unwavering, and dug his ice axe into the wall again and again until he pulled himself out. Pain radiated from his shoulder, his ribs, and every muscle in his legs, but he had moved forward. Every step was a testament to sheer willpower, every breath a defiance of death. At base camp, the storm's aftermath was still visible. Tents were shredded, supplies buried or swept away, and the smell of burning fuel lingered where climbers had tried to heat their meager shelters. Reports came in slowly. Some teams had survived, others hadn't. Elias knew that luck alone had not saved him. Something had intervened, something that defied logic. By the third day, he was strong enough to be flown down the mountain, wrapped tightly against the wind that still carried shards of ice and snow. The helicopter lifted off, and as the mountain shrank beneath him, Elias looked up, instinctively scanning the ridges. The plateau where he had seen her was empty now, untouched by human presence, yet he felt her presence lingering, a soft glow in the memory of his mind. On the way down, memories of his team assaulted him. Faces blurred by snow, voices lost to the wind. He thought of Kamal, the Sherpa who had joked even in the thin air, always offering tea and a kind smile, of Lee, whose courage under frostbite had inspired the group, of every companion swept away by the storm. Grief pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding, and yet alongside it was a profound, impossible gratitude. He had survived, and he would carry the stories of those who hadn't. When he reached the base city, wrapped in warmth, he realized the world had continued on without him. Vehicles moved along icy roads, vendors sold hot tea, families walked bundled against the cold. To them, the mountain was a distant spectacle, majestic but detached. To Elias, it was a living force, unpredictable, terrifying, and, somehow, merciful. In the weeks that followed, his body slowly healed, but the mountain left marks beyond the physical. Elias couldn't shake the sensation that his life had been reordered, that survival was no longer just a personal victory but a sacred responsibility. He began to speak publicly about the climb, not just the technical challenges, but the spiritual awakening, the profound sense of guidance he had felt. Some listeners were skeptical, some indifferent. Others nodded with quiet understanding, those who had known fear, isolation, or brushings with death themselves. Elias didn't mind disbelief. He no longer needed validation. The memory of her, the warmth in the icy void, was enough. It was a secret he carried in the marrow of his bones, a miracle that belonged to him and the mountain. Months later, he returned, not to climb, not to conquer, but to honor. A small memorial was placed at the plateau, a modest stone marked with a cross. He had risked much, yes, but more than that, he wanted to offer thanks. Standing there, wind tearing through his jacket, Elias felt the faintest brush against his hand, like a whisper in the air. He closed his eyes, smiled through the cold, and whispered his own thanks. It was impossible to explain, impossible to capture in words. Survivors' tales often diminish in the telling, eroded by disbelief, by the mundane world that refuses to understand the extremity of the mountains. But Elias knew the truth. He had walked through death and returned, cradled in light he couldn't fully name, guided by a presence that had refused to abandon him. And for the rest of his life, that memory would remain. Not as fantasy, not as hallucination, not even as comfort, it would be a compass. In every hardship, every moment of despair, Elias would remember the plateau, the snow, the figure luminous against the impossible mountain. He would remember that miracles, rare and fragile, could happen. That even in the coldest, deadliest place on earth, life could be preserved. Elias never sought fame. He didn't write a book, didn't give interviews beyond the necessary recounting for rescue records. Yet those who met him felt something unmistakable, a quiet gravity, a sense that he had glimpsed something beyond, something ineffably real. And when he spoke of survival, it was always with the same reverent certainty. "Out there," he said, eyes distant but unwavering, "you're never truly alone. And sometimes, in the darkest moment, help comes in ways you cannot imagine." Elias's life returned to a strange rhythm after Everest. Ordinary tasks felt surreal, the hum of traffic, the chatter of a cafe, even the warmth of a bed. Nothing had prepared him for the quiet mundane that followed the violent extremes of the mountain. Yet, beneath it all, a persistent pulse of gratitude and disbelief ran through him. He had survived what others deemed impossible, and he carried with him a secret he could never fully explain. Months passed. Winter softened into spring, and the world outside the mountains moved on, oblivious to the horrors that still haunted those frozen peaks. Elias began to heal, not just physically, but mentally. Still, there were nights when he dreamt of the blizzard, of the endless snowfields and the perilous ridges. And always she was there. The figure, luminous and serene, waiting on the plateau that no human map recorded. One evening, unable to sleep, Elias returned to the small journal he had kept while stranded. Between sketches of ice formations and frantic notes on his route, he had scrawled the words that had sustained him in the cold. "Do not give up. You are not alone." He traced them with a trembling finger. The words felt heavier now, imbued with a memory of survival, and yet fragile, like a thread holding him to something larger than himself. He realized that what he had experienced was not just a miracle, but a message, that life, even in its most brutal extremes, carried moments of grace. And that grace demanded recognition. Elias began speaking at climbing forums and mountaineering clubs. Not to boast, not to dramatize, but to share the lessons of survival, faith, and perseverance. He recounted the storm, the isolation, the crevasse, the agonizing hunger, and the hallucination, or perhaps vision, that had given him hope. Some listeners were skeptical, others were silent, visibly moved. He did not mind disbelief. The truth of the experience existed independent of acknowledgement. Then, on a cold autumn morning, he received an unexpected invitation. A small, private ceremony on Everest, organized by a local mountaineering foundation. They wanted him to place a commemorative marker on the plateau where he had first seen her, the figure that had guided him through the storm. It felt surreal, almost too coincidental. How could the mountain, still as indifferent as ever, offer a second chance at closure? Elias accepted. Weeks later, wrapped in layers against the high-altitude cold, he returned to the site. The snow had shifted, the winds reshaped the ridges, and yet the plateau remained, a small, untouched sanctum amid the jagged expanse. Kneeling, he placed the simple stone marker, inscribed with a cross and the words, "Gratitude for life, guidance, and hope." As he stood, wind tearing at his jacket and eyes scanning the horizon, a sudden hush fell over the mountains. The storm clouds that had always threatened seemed absent. The sun pierced through in shards of golden light, glinting on the ice. And there she was. Not a hallucination, not a dream, but a subtle shimmer on the ridge, a presence that was more felt than seen. Elias's heart surged, an electric mix of awe and humility. He could not speak, could not move, but he knew she was acknowledging him, affirming that he had honored the miracle. A warmth spread through his chest, different from physical heat. It was a pure, profound sense of peace. For a moment, everything in the world paused. The mountain, usually so violent and indifferent, seemed still. The snow glistened as if each flake bore witness to his survival, and the air felt charged, sacred. Elias closed his eyes, letting the memory of the vision, the guidance, and the miracle wash over him. When he opened them again, the shimmer was gone. Yet he did not feel loss. Instead, he felt a completeness that had eluded him since the storm. He had faced death, endured pain and despair, and been gifted life in the most improbable way. And now, with acknowledgement, he could step away, carrying the miracle within him without needing to chase it. Descending from the plateau was slow and deliberate. Each step reminded him of the fragility of life, the sharp edges of survival, and the power of belief, however inexplicable. By the time he returned to base camp, the winds had picked up, and the mountain loomed in its timeless, indifferent grandeur. But Elias was not afraid. He had faced it once and returned, carrying more than memories. He carried understanding, gratitude, and the quiet certainty that even in the deadliest places, hope could exist. Back at his home city, Elias resumed life. Friends and family noticed subtle changes. He moved with a patience that hadn't been there before, spoke with a calm authority, and carried a quiet reverence for life's fragility. Yet in private moments, he revisited the memory of the mountain and the figure that had saved him. It was a secret shared only between him and the snow, the winds, and the miraculous presence that had guided him through the impossible. He began mentoring young climbers, emphasizing preparation, respect for nature, and the mental fortitude necessary for survival. But he also spoke of something deeper, intangible. The sense that in moments of ultimate vulnerability, guidance could appear, miracles could happen, and that the human spirit could endure far beyond its perceived limits. Years passed. Elias never climbed Everest again. He didn't need to. The mountain had given him what mattered most, not conquest, not fame, but understanding. He would occasionally receive letters from climbers inspired by his story, or from those who had faced their own near-death experiences. He would read them quietly, nodding, understanding fully that survival was more than endurance. It was a gift, fragile and sacred. One evening, as snow began to dust the city rooftops, Elias walked alone. He paused, closing his eyes, feeling the wind against his face. For a fleeting moment, he saw her, the same shimmer, the same calm presence, standing not on the mountain this time, but in the quiet of his mind, reminding him that life was a series of miracles, small and large, seen and unseen. He smiled, whispered a silent thanks, and continued walking, carrying the lesson forward. Elias would never forget the storm, the blinding snow, or the days spent teetering between life and death. Nor would he forget the figure who had appeared when the world seemed utterly lost. And though others might dismiss it as delirium, imagination, or coincidence, he knew the truth. In the heart of Everest, amidst ice, wind, and despair, he had encountered something impossible, and that impossible had saved him. Survival had changed him. Not just the body or the skills, but the soul. He understood now that the mountain, in all its brutality, was a teacher. And miracles, rare and fleeting as they were, could appear when least expected, guiding, protecting, and reminding humanity that even in its darkest hours, hope endured. Elias's life, shaped by ice and wind, faith and endurance, became a testament to survival, to the power of the human spirit, and to the miraculous. And in the quiet moments when the world seemed still, he could close his eyes and feel her presence, reassuring, luminous, and eternal, a reminder that life, against all odds, was always worth fighting for.